Good morning, students, and happy Friday. I hope you're having a good day. This is Mr. Sayer, and we're going to see how this goes. I'm going to kind of give you a little slide presentation, and hopefully you will learn something from this. I'm in my small little office classroom here, and what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the Renaissance, and we are going to talk about how was it connected to how we started the year, and that was the Middle Ages. And it's really important to understand that the Middle Ages kind of set the groundwork, laid the groundwork for the Renaissance, and then exploded with learning. Even though it was a time of real darkness, then it became one of the bright spots in all of the world and all of history. And it's kind of interesting because we're in a time period right now where it seems like there's a lot of darkness, and hopefully from this will explode another type of Renaissance. And the Renaissance was also called the Age of Inquiry or Inquiry. And you're not going to have to be an expert at this, but I just want to get an idea of what's going on. Now, before we start, we're going to do our objectives. I'll do this by myself, but hopefully you're listening. And of course, I know that you're shouting this in your room or wherever you're doing this. So my content objective is today. Students will be able to connect the concept of inquiry with the Renaissance period. And for language objective, today, the students will be able to interpret and explain the connection between the Renaissance, the Age of Inquiry metaphor, and the cab theory. So let's get started. So first and foremost, what I want you to do is on your slideshow, I have shared this with you. You should be able to write on it. And what I want you to do is I want you to answer the question of what do you think the word inquiry or the age of inquiry means? Now, we did this in your vocab the other day, and you can just write that, but it would be great if you could write a little bit more. But I'm going to give you a moment. You can pause this and write down what you think it means, and then maybe by the end you might have a different idea of what it means. Pause, pause. No pressure. Pause, pause. I need some Jeopardy music. Na, 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 na. All right, when you're ready, you can go to the next slide. So the cab theory is something my wife and I actually came up with. We came up with an idea of the Renaissance, and we called it challenging accepted beliefs. And we'll come back to this. First, we're going to look at a metaphor, and this will drive you crazy, but I'm going to say, how many times am I going to say but I'm noticing it, so I'm going to try and not do that as much. But anyway, so the cab theory is one of Mr. Sayer's, I did it again. This is going to drive me crazy now. The cab theory is an acronym to remind you of what these things were. And like I said, we'll come back to it. I don't want to talk about it right this second, but I wanted you to see that it's there. This is the metaphor that we're going to learn from. And we are talking about the spirit of inquiry. And the idea of inquiry is questioning. So you got a tree out in the middle of nowhere, and it says spirit of inquiry, and you're kind of like, what? Why would it be on the trunk? Well, before you got to the trunk, this tree needed to start growing underground. And so the roots spread out. And so we have to think, what was underground? And the things that were underground were happening before the Renaissance. And they were Greek and Roman philosophers. They gave us the classics. Okay? Just like your parents listen to classic music. Some of the things that caused this tree to grow, this was giving it the place to put their roots, to give it food for the tree to grow from the soil. And so during this time, the Greeks and Romans came up with a lot of ideas, and then during the Dark Ages, they kind of shut down. They were so busy trying to defend themselves against the barbarians that they couldn't really think about, going to school, thinking all this other stuff. And so they were out in the fields. They were just trying to make enough food to survive and build castles to defend themselves. So during this time, the Greeks and Romans came up with great ideas. Then they shut down. Sounds like a familiar theme. And the group that actually kept these ideas alive were the people that were criticized by the Christians, and that was the Muslims. And the Muslims looked into the Greek and Roman ideas and said, wow, that's amazing. So their scientists, their philosophers wrote down a lot of these ideas, translated it into Arabic, and they also added their own ideas. So while the barbarians were fighting against the former Roman Empire, the Muslims were just like developing all this stuff, becoming really smart, learning, and preserving the Greek and Roman ideas, which was really amazing. Now, during this time, it didn't just stop with the idea of the spirit of inquiry starting to develop, because right now, the tree hadn't even really grown. But near the end of the Middle Ages, the tree started to grow. And people started to question things and saying, is this good? Is this right? Is it good the way that we are, don't know much about the world? Is it good that we are stuck on these manners and we're just defending ourselves? And over time, they started to have more food. They started to have more defense. So they didn't need that stuff. And so they started to open their eyes to the places around them. And so the Renaissance formed in the 1300s. And the Renaissance was a time of rebirth. And what was it a rebirth of? Going back to their roots. Get it? Metaphor, roots, haha. And that was the Greek and Roman ideas. And so we're going to talk more about that, about what did they value, what did they think was cool from the Greek and Roman ideas. Now, the other thing is, and you guys go back to stuff too. I mean, we had bell bottoms, we call them, okay, and flares and things like that. But you guys also have clothing and stuff like that that your parents used to wear, and you think it's cool, but we've been there, we've done that, all right? The Renaissance was a rebirth of ideas that had been done, but they didn't stop there. They built off of them. Another movement started, and that was called the Protestant Reformation. And it was a reforming of the church. And it was the reforming of the church that existed back then. And the church that existed back then was the Catholic Church. And it wasn't like they wanted to get rid of the Catholic Church. But there were people saying, the Catholic Church is not doing everything right. In areas they're not following what the Bible says. And so there began a group of protesters. That's where you get the word Protestant. And these protesters started with a dude named Martin Luther. And so Martin Luther led a movement against the Catholic Church, and they started the Protestant Reformation. And if you are a Christian and you are part of a church that is not Catholic, then you are probably a Protestant. And that came from the Protestant Reformation over 500 years ago. And that's where Martin Luther King got his name. We'll learn more about that in the future, but I just want you to see the spirit of inquiry was challenging accepted beliefs, and that's where the Renaissance came from. Challenging accepted beliefs of the church, that's where the Protestant Reformation came from. Scientific revolution. This was not the beginning of science, but this was a revolution, and a revolution is a big change, not a small change. It's not like you painted your house. It's your house blew up and you rebuilt it and it's 3 stories high now and all kinds of cool stuff. The scientific revolution went back, looked at ideas from the Greeks, from the Romans, from the Muslims, and there exploded all kinds of ideas that didn't really exist, but they did spring from or grow from or sprout from, hint, hint, metaphor, the ideas of the past. Next was the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment comes from the word light. And they brought light to different institutions, different ways of thinking, different things like how do we look at the government differently? And how do we do things differently? So these were four major movements that sprang from the Renaissance and beyond period that we call it. Let me go back to this. Now, as we're doing this, you can take these ideas, you can copy them and paste them down below. Okay? It's an easy way for you to kind of remember some of this stuff. Now, the spirit of inquiry in Europe took place over like 400 years. Now, I'm going to pause here, blah, 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 da, 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 for you to add those things to the things below. Now, the spirit of inquiry in Europe lasted for 400 years. Now, it still exists today. That's why we have the Silicon Valley. But what happened was that it did happen over this 400-year period. And it emerged from three major things that happened. First was feudalism, where they kind of hunkered down. They were seeking protection from the barbarians, and it was about self-defense. The second was the Crusades, when they started to fight the Christians against the Muslims, as you remember, hopefully. And that was a period of almost 200 years, and they were battling others. But as they were battling others, then they went and they got off the manners and they started to find new ideas, new cultures. And they're like, whoa, this is pretty cool. And they brought them back with them. And people who saw them that they brought them back to said, whoa, these are pretty cool. Now, unfortunately, they also brought back something else, and that was the Black Death. They were not sheltering in place. And the Black Death only lasted about 4 years. But stupidly, as you know, they didn't know what they were doing, and so they would travel to Rome. They went all over the place. And within those 4 years, all that traveling caused between 75 to 200 million people to die in only 4 years because they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't shelter in place. So as a result, Europe was in a state of total chaos. Now, during this chaos, people started to say, are we doing the right things? And so many people started to question what was considered the undebatable truths and challenging their institutions and challenging their authorities. So, for example, their authorities would be people like the king. Should he have the power? And some people came up with things like democracy, where people started to vote. They also came up with something we talked about before, which was the Magna Carta. Should the king have all the power? And some people said no. Okay, so the king may have been left in place in England, but they started a parliament who really had the power then and had the power now. They also would challenge leaders and the church, like the Pope and the Catholic Church. And they said, you know what? You're not perfect. You're not making all the right decisions. And so that's where things like the Protestant Reformation came from. People started challenging scientific ideas, where if you would say things that they thought weren't in the Bible, you'd get kicked out of church. You'd be excommunicated. And the people thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to hell. Well, then people started to say, well, is the earth really at the center and everything's revolving around it? And they started to study it. They started to think for themselves. And they said, wow, interesting. It looks like the sun's in the middle. And that's where the scientific revolution came from. And then also later, there was the Enlightenment. So they questioned the idea of the status quo. And the status quo is the way things are, the way things have been. They started challenging current social structures and values. Okay, should I be able to move up? Should I be able to become smart, go to university and be able to move up and not be stuck like the serfs were in the past? So there was a spirit of inquiry by all kinds of people, and it just emerged from their situation. And so that kind of lays the groundwork for the spirit of inquiry. Now, the thing that happened also was here are the four different movements. And what I'm going to have you do, and this is going to be just kind of a copy and paste, but we will be using this more next week. But this was a time of, like I say, great change. And so I'm going to show you the answers to these different four movements. So check this out. So during the Renaissance, they challenged traditional views, which resulted in new developments in art and literature. And some of the people that were important were Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, Machiavelli. There's also one that is not listed there, but he, and I won't even tell you who he is, he was one of the Ninja Turtles. And the Ninja Turtles were named after the four greats. And we'll learn more about these dudes next week. But they did challenge traditional views. The Protestant Reformation, we've talked about a little bit before. They challenged the Roman Catholic Church and the authority, which would be the Pope. This resulted in the creation of many non-Catholic Christian churches. So they were Christian, but they were not Catholic. And in the future, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about Martin Luther, John Calvin, Elizabeth I, Ignatius of Loyola. So we'll talk about all that. Scientific revolution. This was major changes. Again, revolution is not a small change. It's a major change. And this movement challenged traditional views about society and nature. This resulted in advances in math and science. Some of the major people would be Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Bra, and yeah, that's not where that started. Bacon, yeah, there was a dude named Thomas Bacon, and Descartes. Last but not least was the Enlightenment, where they challenged the authority of institutions like the church and government, which resulted in greater freedom of thought. And Thomas Hobbes, John Locke were some of the important people. That's where we get Hobbes and Calvin, which is Calvin and Hobbes. Both of those guys were important, and if you like the cartoon strip, that's where the idea came from, those two guys' names. So here's where you're going to fill out all your stuff, which you have, and then after you're done with that, you're going to also copy and paste stuff into here. Then what I want you to do is just tell me, how much time did this take you in terms of minutes? Thanks for doing this. Have a nice weekend. Also later today, the teachers are going to be sending out to you probably a questionnaire just to ask you, how is it going this week? We want to hear from you because it's really important that we know what you're thinking, not only in terms of school, but personally, how's it going? How's it going with your family? Because that's all super important. And we all know that things are obviously weird right now. And there's some stresses right now. So we want to support you as a school, but we also need to know what's going on a little bit so we can reach out to you right where you're at. Anyway, hope you have a great weekend, and thanks for taking the time to watch this. Bye-bye.